Untamable horse is sold at auction, but what the rancher did left everyone in shock. Dust swirls across the corral as a black stallion thrashes, eyes blazing, chains rattling like thunder. No one dares raise a hand until a weary rancher steps forward. With just a single dollar, he claims the horse they call Satan's Fury. The crowd roars with laughter, certain he's signed his death sentence. But when the rancher kneels, whispering words of scripture, the beast falls silent. 4. The first time, the town itself seems to hold its breath. What no one knows is that this horse carries a secret brand, one that ties him to a fallen warrior's son and a people desperate not to lose their last legacy. And now, the rancher must choose between survival, law, and justice while enemies. Circle and his daughter's life hangs in the balance. In a land where hate runs deep and mercy is mocked, can faith tame what fear cannot? Or will the untamable destroy them all? Comment below and tell me where in the world you're joining from. And if this story made you pause for a moment, hit that subscribe button for more The Spring Morning Air, bit sharp and cold as townspeople. Huddled together at Miller's auction yard, their breath rose in white puffs while they stamped their feet against the chill, gathering close to watch the day's main attraction. Dust clouds billowed up from the packed dirt of the corral as 4 men struggled with thick ropes, dragging forward a massive black stallion that seemed to block out the pale March sun. Satan's Fury is what they're calling him, whispered a woman near the front, clutching her shawl tighter. Killed 2 men already, they say. The beast lived up to his fearsome name. 17 hands high if he was an inch, with a coat as black as midnight and eyes that flashed like fire. His muscles rippled beneath his gleaming hide as he reared up. Suddenly, massive hooves slicing through the air. The handlers scattered like leaves in a windstorm, barely escaping those deadly feet. Laughter erupted from the crowd, tinged with nervous energy. "Ain't nobody fool enough to bid on that devil horse?" called out Tom Webster, the livery stable owner. More chuckles followed his words as the stallion snorted and pawed at the ground, sending clods of earth flying. Near the back of the gathering, Mateo Boone sat quietly on a rough-hewn bench, his daughter Christy pressed close against his side. His dark eyes studied the horse with an intensity that spoke of years reading animal behavior, both in peacetime and during the war. The stallion's movements told a story, not of evil, but of fear and confusion. "Papa," Christy whispered, her small hand tightening on his arm. "We don't need more trouble. The ranch is hard enough already." Her young face carried worry beyond her 11 years, thinking of their struggling spread and the long hours her father already worked. Mateo patted her hand gently, but kept his eyes on the horse. The auctioneer, red-faced and sweating despite the cold, climbed onto his platform. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out, trying to sound confident. "We open the bidding. At $50 for this fine specimen of horseflesh. Who'll give me 50? His words fell into complete silence, broken only by the angry snorts of the stallion. $40. The auctioneer's voice grew desperate. 30, 20. Still no response from the crowd, who had drawn back even further from the corral. Fence. Surely someone will offer something for this magnificent animal. Mateo stood slowly, his movement drawing all eyes. He was not a large man, but something in his quiet bearing commanded attention. $1, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then laughter exploded from every direction, harsh and mocking. Boone's lost his mind. Someone shouted, "Better start digging your grave, Mateo. That horse'll kill you, sure as sunrise." The auctioneer looked around frantically, hoping for another bid, any bid. Finding none, he slumped in defeat. "Sold to Mateo Boone for $1, he announced, shaking his head at the madness of it all. Christy clutched at her father's sleeve. "Papa, please don't," she begged. But Matteo was already moving forward, his steps measured and calm. The crowd parted before him, no one wanting to be too close to what they were certain would be a deadly encounter. The stallion's handlers backed away quickly, relief plain on their faces as they thrust the lead rope toward Matteo. The horse pawed the ground. Again, muscles bunched and ready to strike. His nostrils flared wide, testing this new human scent. What happened next left the crowd breathless. Instead of grabbing the rope, Matteo slowly knelt in the dirt, his movements deliberate and gentle. His lips moved in what appeared to be prayer, though only those closest could hear the whispered words of Scripture passing his lips. "The Lord is my shepherd," he murmured, never taking his eyes from the horse. "I shall not want." The stallion's ears, which had been pinned flat against his head, pricked forward. Something in Matteo's quiet voice or calm demeanor caught his attention. The great head lowered slightly, nostrils flaring wider as he took in the scent of this strange human who showed no fear, with movements so slow they were barely perceptible. Matteo reached for the lead rope. Instead of grasping it to control the horse, he began to unbuckle it, freeing the animal from its restraint. Gasps rose from the crowd. Several women turned away, unable to watch what they were certain would be a tragedy. Even the most hardened ranchers found themselves holding their breath, waiting for the killing strike of those deadly hooves. But the strike never came. As the rope fell away, Satan's fury remained still, his eyes fixed on Matteo. The horse snorted once, powerful and deep, his ears continuing their curious forward dance. Man and horse regarded each other in the dust-filled corral, neither moving, neither showing any sign of aggression. The silence that fell over the auction yard was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The morning sun broke through, the clouds casting long shadows across the packed earth as Matteo slowly rose to his feet, never breaking eye contact with the stallion. "Come on, boy," he said softly, taking one step backward. To the amazement of all watching, the great black horse took a single step forward, following Matteo's movement. There was no rope between them now, no force or constraint, only a connection that none of the onlookers could quite understand. Christie, who had been watching with her hands pressed against her mouth, slowly lowered them. Wonder replaced the fear in her young face as she saw her father's gentle way win out over the horse's fury. The same quiet strength that had helped her through the loss of her mother now seemed to reach out and touch this wild creature's spirit. The crowd remained frozen in place, watching as Matteo backed another step and another, the stallion following like a shadow. The horse's head remained low, his movements cautious but no longer threatening. The terrible tension that had filled his massive frame began to ease, replaced by something that looked remarkably like curiosity. "Would you look at that?" Tom Webster breathed, breaking the spell of silence. "Never seen anything like it in all my born days." The auctioneer, still perched on his platform, shook his head in disbelief. "Sold for $1, he repeated softly. "Cheapest miracle I ever saw." Matteo continued his slow retreat across the corral, the stallion matching him step for step. When they reached the gate, he paused, allowing the horse to take in his new surroundings. The animal's ears swiveled, taking in every sound. But his eyes never left Matteo's face. The morning sun climbed higher, washing the scene in clear light. Where before the crowd had seen a devil horse, now they saw something different, a magnificent animal beginning to understand that not all humans brought pain and fear. And in Matteo Boone, they saw not a foolish man rushing to his death, but a gentle soul whose faith and patience had accomplished what force and fear could not. The evening sun cast long shadows across the rutted road as Matteo led the great black stallion toward home. His boots crunched steadily in the gravel, matching the horse's measured steps behind him. No rope connected them, Just trust, fragile as a spring flower, but growing stronger with each passing mile. Christy followed a few paces back on her gentle mare, Daisy. Her lips moved in silent prayer, though her worried eyes never left her father's back. The mare's bridle jingled softly in the quiet air as they passed the Miller place. Old Jim Miller paused in his porch, sweeping to stare. "Gone plumb crazy, Mateo," he called out, leaning on his broom. "That beast'll be the death of you or your girl. Mark my words." Mateo touched the brim of his hat, but kept walking. The stallion's ears flicked at Miller's voice, but remained forward, focused on Mateo's steady movements ahead. Near the crossroads, Sarah Thompson stood at her garden gate, basket of eggs forgotten in her hands. "Lord have mercy, Boone," she muttered, shaking her head. "Ain't your ranch struggling enough without taking on Satan himself?" The whispers and warnings followed them all the way home. Each neighbor they passed had something to say about Mateo's foolishness, about the risks he was taking, about how a widower with a young daughter had no business bringing home a killer horse. The sun was touching the western hills when they finally turned onto their own land. The small ranch house stood solid against the darkening sky, lamplight already glowing warm in the kitchen window. The barn needed fresh paint, and the fence rails showed signs of hard times, but the place still held the dignified air of a home well loved. "I'll start supper, Papa," Christy said, sliding from Daisy's back. She led her mare to the smaller corral, moving with the quiet efficiency of long practice. The screen door creaked as she disappeared inside, and soon the smell of wood smoke rose. From the kitchen chimney, Mateo guided the stallion toward the sturdiest corral, the one built from thick cedar posts sunk deep in the rocky soil. The horse followed willingly enough, though his muscles tensed when they approached the gate. Mateo paused, giving him time to settle. "Easy now," he murmured. "No one's going to hurt you here." The stallion blew out a long breath, then stepped through the gate of his own accord. His hooves thudded against the packed earth as he explored his new enclosure, testing the boundaries. Most ranchers would have tied him tight to a post for the night, but Mateo left him free to move. Force bred fear, and there'd been enough of that in this animal's life. Inside the kitchen, warmth and savory smells wrapped around him like a familiar blanket. Christy stood at the stove, stirring a pot of rabbit stew. She'd already set the table, with their mismatched plates and the blue cups her mother had loved. "Smells mighty fine," Mateo said. Hanging his hat on its peg, TCRI ladled the stew into bowls, then sat across from her father. They bowed their heads as Mateo said grace, thanking the Lord for their food and asking blessing on their home. They raised their heads. Christy's eyes held questions she couldn't hold back any longer. "Papa," she began, crumbling her cornbread into her stew, "why'd you do it? Why risk everything on that horse? Mr. Webster says he's killed 2 men already." Mateo took his time answering, stirring his stew thoughtfully. "The Lord laid it on my heart, child. Plain as day, he told me not to let that animal be destroyed. But we can barely feed the cattle we've got," Christy pressed. And with the creek running low, she trailed off, worry creasing her young forehead. "Sometimes the Lord asks us to trust him, even when it don't make earthly sense," Mateo said gently. "I reckon he's got his reasons, though I can't see them clear just yet." A sudden whinny from the corral interrupted their conversation. The stallion's hooves drummed against the ground, an urgent rhythm in the gathering dark. "Finish your supper," Mateo told Christy. "I'll go check on him." He grabbed the lantern from its hook and lit it, the flame catching quick and steady. Outside, stars were beginning to prick through the purple twilight. The stallion stood at the far end of the corral, pawing restlessly at the earth. Mateo approached slowly, holding the lantern high. Something in the horse's movement worried him. Not the wild fury from this morning, but a different kind of sick distress. The stallion allowed him to draw near, though his sides heaved with quick breaths in the lantern light. Mateo studied the animal more carefully than he'd been able to during the day. The black coat, though dusty, showed signs of good breeding: long legs, deep chest, proud head. This was no ordinary ranch horse. As he moved the light along the horse's flank, something caught his eye. There, half hidden by healing skin and patchy hair, was a brand. Mateo leaned closer, careful not to touch. The mark was unusual, not the simple letters or numbers used by local ranchers, but a pattern of symbols he'd seen somewhere before. Memory stirred like autumn leaves. During his time helping with treaty negotiations, he'd seen similar marks on documents from the Ute Reservation 30 miles to the north. His heart sank as understanding dawned. This wasn't just any stolen horse. This was likely a Ute horse, probably taken during one of the raids that had plagued the territory lately. The stallion nudged Mateo's shoulder, surprisingly gentle for an animal everyone called killer. In the big horse's eyes, Mateo saw not evil but pain. The pain of separation, of rough handling, of being far from home. "Lord," he whispered into the night air, "I sure could use some wisdom here." The stars wheeled overhead, silent and bright. As he considered his options, if the horse truly belonged to the Ute people, keeping him would be theft, plain and simple. But returning him meant crossing cultural boundaries that few whites dared to bridge, risking misunderstanding and possible violence. The screen door creaked, and Christy's voice floated out. "Papa, the dishes need washing." "Coming, child," he called back, taking one last look at the brand. Tomorrow would be soon enough to decide what to do. For tonight, at least, the horse was safe. The stallion watched him go, dark eyes reflecting the lantern light like distant stars. His soft nickering followed Mateo across the yard, a sound that seemed to hold both gratitude and longing gratitude. For kindness shown and longing for something or somewhere far away. Inside, the familiar sounds of dishwashing and Christy's quiet humming filled the kitchen. But Mateo's mind remained in the corral with that mysterious brand and all the questions it raised. He'd asked the Lord for guidance in saving the horse. Now he needed that guidance more than ever to know what to do with him. Morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen window as Mateo and Christy finished their breakfast. The cornbread crumbs scattered across their plates, and the coffee pot sat nearly empty between them. Outside, the stallion's occasional nickering drifted in on the cool spring breeze. "We need supplies from town," Mateo said, pushing back from the table. "Might as well let folks see we survived the night with that horse." Christy nodded, already reaching for her shawl. "I'll saddle Daisy." The ride into town took longer than usual. The black stallion, though calmer than yesterday, still commanded respect. Mateo kept him at a walk, speaking quietly whenever the horse's ears flicked at sudden movements. Christy rode beside them on her mare, casting worried glances at the passing farms. As they approached the town's main street, curtains twitched in windows. Shopkeepers paused in their sweeping. Mothers drew children closer to their skirts. "There goes the fool who bought Satan's fury," someone muttered loud enough to carry. "Ain't gonna last a week," another voice added. Mateo kept his eyes forward, guiding the stallion toward the blacksmith's shop. The horse needed checking for shoes, and Tom Wheeler was the only smithy who might understand Mateo's gentle approach. They had just dismounted when a shadow fell across the dusty street. An elderly native woman approached, her movements deliberate and dignified despite her age. Her dark eyes fixed on the stallion's flank where the mysterious brand lay, partially hidden by his coat. The woman's presence drew attention. Townspeople gathered at a careful distance, sensing drama about to unfold. Mateo noticed how they kept back, torn between fear of the horse and curiosity about the unexpected visitor. "I am Naomi," the woman said, her voice carrying clear authority. Despite its softness, I speak for my grandson Jone, son of White Eagle. Christy stepped closer to her father, gripping his sleeve. The stallion's ears swiveled toward Naomi, but he remained still, almost attentive. That brand, Naomi continued, pointing with a weathered hand, marks Thunder Runner. Horse of my son White Eagle, who fell in battle last summer. The horse disappeared in raid 2 moons ago. Now he stands here, far from where he belongs. Mateo felt the weight of her words settle like stones in his stomach. Ma'am, he said carefully, I purchased this horse yesterday at public auction. Fair and legal. Legal. Naomi's voice carried an edge of bitter wisdom. What is legal is not always right. This horse was stolen from my grandson Jone, without Thunder Runner. The boy loses his father's legacy, his connection to warrior line. Christy tugged at Mateo's sleeve. Papa, please listen to her. The crowd pressed closer, eager for conflict. Mateo saw Thompson from the bank smirking, Webster from the livery stable shaking his head. They expected, perhaps hoped for, angry. Words, threats, violence. Instead, Naomi's dignity seemed to fill the street. My grandson mourns both father and horse. Thunder Runner is more than property. He is memory, he is family, he is future. Her eyes met Mateo's. You have daughter. You understand legacy. Before Mateo could respond, quick footsteps interrupted. The Indian agent strode toward them, his boots kicking up dust, his face set in lines of annoyed authority. What's all this? He demanded, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. Naomi, you know you're not supposed to be in town without permission. Sir, Mateo began, we're just having a peaceful I know. What's peaceful and what isn't? The agent cut him off. That horse is government property now. All reservation stock falls under federal jurisdiction. Government property. Naomi's voice held carefully controlled anger. Thunder Runner was my son's horse, earned in battle, raised from colt. No paper in Washington changes this truth. The agent's face reddened. Now see here, the boy needs. His father's horse, Christy burst out, then shrank back as all eyes turned to her. Young lady, the agent said stiffly, this is no concern of yours. He turned to Naomi. Return to the reservation immediately. If you have complaints, file them through proper channels. Naomi stood straight, her silence more powerful than any protest. She looked once more at the stallion, then at Mateo. You have kind eyes, she said softly. I pray they see truth. With that, she turned and walked away, her dignity intact. The crowd dispersed, disappointed at the lack of spectacle. The agent straightened his vest, clearly pleased with his own authority. Good day, Mr. Boone. I trust we'll have no more disruptions. Mateo barely heard him. He was watching Naomi's retreating figure, remembering her words about legacy and truth. The stallion shifted restlessly, as if he too felt the weight of the moment. Papa, Christy's voice was small. Can we go home now? They gathered their supplies quickly, the earlier errands forgotten in the shadow of Naomi's visit. The ride home passed in silence, both father and daughter lost in thought. Even the stallion seemed subdued, his proud head carried lower than before. That evening, after a quiet supper, Mateo knelt beside Christy's bed for their nightly prayers. The lamp cast soft shadows on her worried face as she clasped her hands. Dear Lord, she began, her voice trembling slightly, please help us do what's right, not just what's easy. She paused, then added, and please help Jone not be so sad. About his papa and his horse, Mateo remained kneeling long after Christy fell asleep, her words echoing in his mind. Through the open window came the soft sounds of the stallion moving in his corral. Thunder Runner, he corrected himself, using the horse's true name for the first time. The matter wasn't as simple as right and wrong anymore. Legal ownership, tangled with moral obligation, and somewhere in the middle stood a grieving boy and his grandmother, waiting for justice that the law seemed unwilling to provide. Dawn painted the eastern sky in pale gold as Mateo saddled Thunderrunner. The stallion stood quietly, his coat gleaming in the early light. Frost still clung to the fence posts, and their breath made small clouds in the chilly morning air. "Papa, wait." Christy hurried from the house, wrapping a thick wool shawl around her shoulders. "I want to come too." Mateo paused, one hand on the saddle horn. It might not be pleasant business at the reservation. "Please." She clutched her shawl tighter. "I've been praying about it all night." Something in her earnest face reminded him so much of her mother that his chest tightened. "All right," he nodded. "Get Daisy ready." They rode slowly through the spring-softened fields, hooves squelching in mud left by recent rains. Thunderrunner picked his way carefully, showing none of his former wildness. Christy hummed hymns as they traveled, her voice carrying on the morning breeze. "What will you tell them at the agency?" she asked during a quiet moment. "That I'm checking grazing boundaries," Mateo replied. "It's truth enough, we do need to know where our cattle can roam." The reservation spread before them as they crested a low hill. A cluster of government buildings stood stark against the landscape: the agency office, a small chapel, and various outbuildings. Beyond these lay scattered homes and corrals where the Ute people had been told to settle. The Indian agent met them at the office door, his wire-rimmed glasses catching the sunlight. "Mr. Boone," he said coldly, "this is unexpected." "Just checking grazing limits," Mateo explained, dismounting. "Don't want our cattle straying where they shouldn't." The agent's thin lips pressed together. "I assume this visit has nothing to do with yesterday's incident, should it?" Inside the office, maps covered one wall and filing cabinets lined another. The agent settled behind his desk, shuffling papers importantly. "Let me be clear, Mr. Boone. That stallion is government property now. All reservation stock falls under federal control." "The horse was purchased at public auction," Mateo said. Quietly indeed. "And how it arrived at that auction is not your concern." The agent's tone grew sharper. "I advise you to remember your place. Questioning government authority could lead to complications." Christy, who had been standing silently beside her father, suddenly spoke up. "But sir, if the horse belongs to someone else, young lady." The agent cut her off. "These matters are beyond a child's understanding." Through the office window, sounds of children playing drifted in. Christy turned toward the noise clearly, eager to escape the tension in the room. "Go on," Mateo touched her shoulder. "I'll be out soon." She slipped outside while the agent droned on about boundaries and regulations. Mateo half listened, his attention drawn to the window where he could see Christy approaching a group of children near the chapel. One boy stood slightly apart from the others. He appeared about Christy's age, with dignity beyond his years in the way he held himself. He watched her approach without moving. Outside, Christy smiled and waved. "Hello, I'm Christy Boone." The boy hesitated, then nodded politely. "I am Jonay." Mateo's chest tightened. This was the grandson Naomi had spoken of. He watched as the two children stood awkwardly for a moment before Christy, ever friendly, began asking about a string game one of the other children was playing. The agent's voice droned on. "Furthermore, any interference with government property, Soft nickering interrupted him. Thunderrunner, tied outside, had caught Jonay's attention. The boy had gone completely still, his eyes fixed on the stallion. "Thunderrunner," he whispered, the name carrying clearly through the open window. Mateo watched as Jonay approached the horse with reverence. His small hand reached out, touching the stallion's muscled neck. Thunder Runner lowered his proud head, breathing softly into the boy's palm. "He remembers you," Christy said quietly. Jonah nodded, tears filling his eyes but not falling. "My father raised him from a colt. They rode as one spirit." His voice caught. "After father fell in battle, Thunder Runner was all I had left of him." The stallion's gentle nickering mixed with the boy's quiet words. Mateo felt something shift in his chest, watching their reunion. This was more than ownership. It was family, heritage, love, Mr. Boone. The agent's sharp voice yanked him back. "Are you listening? This is important." 2 agency clerks had entered the office. They stood like sentinels beside the agent's desk, their faces stern. "Let me be absolutely clear," the agent continued. "That horse must be surrendered to government. Custody. Refusal could result in serious charges, interference with federal property, disruption of reservation order, possibly even inciting unrest." Mateo glanced out the window again. Jonah was showing Christy how to offer her palm to Thunder Runner, teaching her the proper way to greet such a proud animal. The boy's earlier tears had dried, replaced by a gentle smile as he shared his knowledge. "Mr. Boone," one of the clerks stepped forward. "Your answer?" "I'll need time to consider the matter," Mateo said carefully. "Consider carefully," the agent's voice held warning. Very carefully indeed. The ride home seemed longer, the spring mud deeper. Christy was unusually quiet, lost in thought as Daisy plodded along beside Thunder Runner. Finally, as they approached their own farm, she spoke. "Papa Jonah showed me how Thunder Runner likes to be greeted. He knows so much about horses. His father taught him everything." She paused. "He told me about his father, too. How brave he was, how kind." Mateo nodded, encouraging her to continue. "They used to ride together every day, Jonah and his father. Thunder Runner would carry them both." Her voice grew thick with tears. "Papa, we can't let him lose everything." "It isn't right." The evening sun painted long shadows across their yard as they unsaddled the horses. Thunder Runner moved into his corral with quiet dignity, his coat glowing copper in the fading light. "The agent said it's government property now," Mateo said softly, more to himself than Christy. "But you saw them together," Christy insisted. "You saw how Thunder Runner remembered him, how Jonah knew exactly where to scratch behind his ears, too. Make him happy." She grabbed her father's sleeve. "Papa, please. Remember what you always say about doing what's right even when it's hard." Mateo stood silent, watching Thunder Runner move in his corral. The horse seemed to glow in the sunset. Light, proud and beautiful, and carrying the weight of so much more than simple ownership. "I'll pray about it tonight," he finally said. "I'll pray too," Christy promised, hugging him tight. "God will show us the right path." Later, after Christy had gone to bed, Mateo sat on the porch steps. The evening air carried the scent of spring, grass, and distant rain. From the corral came soft sounds as Thunder Runner settled for the night. The law stood clear on one side. His own needs, the ranch's needs, stood on another, and between them stretched the path of justice, of doing right by a boy who had already lost so much. Mateo sat long into the darkness, wrestling with choices that would shape more than just his own future. The Sunday morning sun painted the church steeple gold against a cloudless sky. Mateo adjusted his tie as he helped Christy from their wagon, her blue dress freshly pressed for services. The wooden steps creaked beneath their boots as they climbed. To the church entrance, inside, the usual welcoming murmurs felt different today. Whispers followed them down the aisle, like autumn leaves skittering across wooden floorboards. Christy clutched her father's hand tighter as they settled into their usual pew near the middle. "Did you hear?" Mrs. Peterson's stage whisper carried from 2 rows back. "Consorting with reservation folk about that demon horse. Not natural," someone else muttered. Warhorse like that belongs with white folks who know how to handle it. Christie's shoulders tensed. Mateo squeezed her hand gently, reminding her to keep her eyes forward. The morning sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, painting rainbow patterns across worn hymnals. Pastor Roberts took his place at the pulpit, his silver hair catching the light. "Let us turn to Galatians," he began, "where Paul speaks of unity in Christ Jesus." His gentle voice filled the small sanctuary. "There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." As the sermon continued, Mateo noticed the sideways glances, the subtle shifting in pews when the pastor spoke of breaking down walls between peoples. Even good Christians, it seemed, struggled with some barriers. After the final hymn, Mateo hoped to make a quiet exit. But a group of townsmen blocked their path near the door. Tom Wheeler, the hardware store owner, stepped forward first. "Mateo," he said, voice low and serious, "been meaning to have a word about that stallion situation. Ain't right. Letting those reservation folk lay claim to good horseflesh." Frank Miller added, tobacco juice staining his beard. "A Ute boy don't need a warhorse. What's he gonna do with it anyway?" Christie's face flushed red. She opened her mouth to speak, but Mateo's gentle touch on her shoulder kept her quiet. "That stallion," Mateo said carefully, "like all creatures, belongs first to the Lord. I aim to pray on what's right by him. Now see here," Wheeler pressed closer, "we ain't saying nothing against Scripture. But there's practical matters to consider. That horse could bring good money at the right sale. Help your ranch proper." Mateo met their eyes steadily. "All God's creatures deserve respect," he said quietly. "And all his children deserve justice. Even those who look different from us." The words hung in the air like dust motes in sunlight. Someone coughed. Others shuffled their feet. Finally, Wheeler stepped aside, though his face showed clear disapproval. More whispers followed them to their wagon. Christie climbed up beside her father, her small hands gripping her hymnal too tightly. "Papa," she whispered as they drove home, "why do they talk that way about Jonah? He's just a boy like any other." Mateo considered his words carefully. "Fear makes people say unkind things, sometimes. Fear of what's different. But the Lord calls us to be braver than our fears." The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. Christie helped with Sunday chores, feeding chickens, checking fences, making sure Thunderrunner had fresh water in his corral. As evening approached, she was in the kitchen starting supper when she spotted movement near the barn. "Papa," she called softly, "someone's coming." Mateo looked out the window to see two figures approaching in the gathering dusk, an elderly woman and a young boy. Naomi and Jonah walked slowly, carrying something wrapped in cloth. "Should we hide Thunderrunner?" Christie whispered. Mateo shook his head. "No need to hide what isn't stolen." He stepped onto the porch to greet them. "Evening, Naomi." "Evening, Jonah." Naomi inclined her head respectfully. "We bring thanks," she said, unwrapping the cloth to reveal strips of dried venison. "For caring well for Thunderrunner, you've come a long way," Mateo said. "Please, join us for supper." Christie's face brightened. "I just made fresh biscuits." Inside, she quickly set two more places at the table while Mateo lit the lantern. Its warm glow softened the kitchen shadows as they gathered around the simple meal, biscuits, beans, and now the shared venison. Naomi spoke a quiet blessing in her own tongue before they ate. Though the words were foreign, their reverence needed no translation. They ate slowly, sharing the comfortable silence of those who need not fill every moment with words. Jonah sat beside Christie, his eyes occasionally drifting to the window, where Thunderrunner's shape could be seen in the falling darkness. The horse's occasional nickering drifted in like a gentle reminder of his presence. "My father," Jonah said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. He had a dream about Thunder Runner. Once, he glanced at his grandmother, who nodded encouragement. He said the horse would one day build a bridge between peoples, not a bridge of wood or stone, but of understanding. The lantern flame flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Christy leaned forward, entranced. What kind of understanding? The kind that comes when hearts open to each other, Naomi answered. When old fears fall away like autumn leaves. Mateo studied their faces in the gentle light. Naomi's lined with wisdom, Coney's bright with youth, Christy's glowing with hope. Something was happening here in this simple sharing of food and stories. Something that felt like the first fruits of his answered prayers. I will pray on your father's dream, he told Jonah solemnly, and asked the Lord's guidance in understanding its meaning for us all. The boy nodded, his eyes showing a glimpse of the man he would become. Outside, Thunder Runner whinnied softly, as if adding his own voice to the promise of the moment. They finished their meal in that same gentle quiet, the lantern light holding them in its warm circle while evening deepened beyond the windows. Here, away from town, whispers and suspicious glances, they were simply people sharing food and fellowship. Perhaps, Mateo thought, this was how bridges began, not with grand gestures, but with small moments of shared humanity. The Wednesday sun climbed high over Boone Ranch, bringing no relief from the mounting troubles that seemed to multiply like weeds after spring rain. Mateo wiped sweat from his brow as he stared down into the main well. The water level had dropped again, leaving barely enough for basic needs. He'd have to haul water from the creek soon if the drought continued. Papa, Christy's voice carried from the north pasture. The cattle are out again. Mateo grabbed his hat, hurrying toward her call. Through the morning haze, he spotted his daughter atop her mare, already moving to head off 3 wayward steers. Pride swelled in his chest as he watched her handle the horse with growing confidence, despite her small size. Keep them heading east, he called, swinging onto his own mount. Together, they pushed the strays back toward the broken section of fence. The beasts moved sluggishly in the heat, their ribs showing more than they should this early in the season. We need rain something fierce, Christy said, pulling up beside him once the cattle were secured. Her face was smudged with dust, but her eyes sparkled with the satisfaction of work well done. That we do, little one. Mateo dismounted to examine the fallen fence rails. That we do. They'd barely finished temporary repairs when Jonah appeared on foot, carrying tools from his grandmother's place. The boy moved with quiet purpose, as if he'd been helping on the ranch his whole life. Grandmother sent me, he explained simply. Said you might need extra hands. Mateo nodded gratefully. Reckon she's right. Got fence posts to set all along the south line. They worked through the morning, Mateo showing Jonah how to dig post holes to the right depth and set the rails at proper angles. The boy learned quickly, his small hands already calloused from other work. Christy brought them water in tin cups, then stayed to help. Passing tools and holding rails steady, around noon, the Henderson brothers rode past on their way to town. Their wagon slowed as they spotted the unlikely work crew. Well, look at that. Earl Henderson called out, his voice carrying clear across the field. Mateo Boone's ranchin' with an Indian boy now. His brother Jed spat in the dust. Ain't natural, if you ask me. Mateo kept his eyes on his work, tamping earth firmly around a fresh post. Beside him, Jonah's shoulders tensed, but he too remained. Focused on his task, Creasy glared at the passing wagon until it disappeared around the bend. Don't mind them none, Mateo said quietly. Good work speaks louder than loose talk. They finished the fence line as afternoon shadows lengthened. Back at the house, smoke curled from the chimney where Naomi had taken over the kitchen. The smell of beans and bacon filled the air, making stomachs growl. Come eat, she called from the doorway. Food tastes better shared. They washed up at the pump, the cool water refreshing after hours in the sun. Inside, Naomi had set the table with Christy's help. Steam rose from bowls of beans studded with bacon, while cornbread waited warm from the oven. "Smells like heaven," Mateo said, settling into his chair as they ate. Naomi's voice grew soft with memory. "Thunderrunner, sire," she began, "was called Storm Spirit by our people. He ran like lightning across the plains, faster than any horse before or since. Christy leaned forward. Food forgotten. "Really? Was he black like Thunderrunner?" "Black as night," Naomi confirmed, "with a star on his chest, like the morning star. They say he could outrun the wind itself." "Is that true?" Christy whispered. Naomi's eyes twinkled. "Truth lives in stories passed down, little one. They carry wisdom even when facts grow misty with time." After supper, while Christy helped Naomi with dishes, Mateo sat at the table with his ledger. Numbers marched across the page in neat rows, telling a story of their own, and it wasn't a happy one. The ranch was struggling. Without rain soon, they'd lose more cattle. They needed strength for heavy work, hauling water, moving feed, driving the herd to better grazing. His eyes drifted to the window where Thunderrunner's dark shape moved in the corral. The stallion's power could make all the difference, if only. Mateo closed the ledger and stepped outside. Stars were beginning to appear in the deepening blue above. From memory, he spoke the words of Psalm 23 into the gathering dusk. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." Thunderrunner's ears pricked toward his voice. The great horse moved to the fence, no longer showing the wild fear that had marked him at the auction. Mateo reached out slowly, palm flat. The stallion's velvet nose brushed his hand, warm breath ghosting across his skin. "Well now," Mateo whispered, "reckon we're getting somewhere." He stood there in the sweet evening air, stroking the horse's nose, feeling the quiet trust growing between them. Perhaps this was what hope felt like. Not a sudden burst of light, but a slow warming, like dawn stealing across the prairie. Thunderrunner could be more than just a symbol of discord. With patience and care, he could help save the ranch. More than that, he could prove what Mateo had always believed, that trust given freely was stronger than any force of control. The screen door creaked behind him. Small boots scuffed on. Wooden boards as Christy came to stand beside him. She reached up to pat Thunderrunner's neck, her touch gentle and sure. "He's not Satan's fury at all, is he, Papa?" she asked. "He just needed somebody to believe in him." Mateo looked down at his daughter's upturned face, then across to where Jonah and Naomi were gathering their things to head home. The boy paused to whisper something to the horse in his own language, and Thunderrunner nickered softly in response. "No, little one," Mateo agreed. He just needed the right people to help him remember who he truly is. Sunday afternoon brought a gentle breeze across Boone Ranch, rustling the fresh spring leaves. Mateo stood in his yard, surveying the preparations for the evening's gathering. Wooden benches formed a circle around a carefully built fire pit. Lanterns hung from posts, ready to light as darkness fell. His heart thumped with nervous anticipation. Would anyone even come? Christy darted between the house and yard, setting out tin plates and checking her cornbread cooling on the windowsill. The warm, sweet smell drifted across the yard, mixing with the scent of coffee brewing on the outdoor fire. "Papa, do you think both sides will really come?" she asked, smoothing her Sunday dress for the 100th time. "We'll see, little one. We've done our part by inviting them." Mateo adjusted his collar, freshly pressed for the occasion. "The rest is in the Lord's hands." Word had spread quickly through town after church that morning. Some folks had laughed outright at the idea of breaking bread with Indians. Others had grown quiet, considering. Mateo had extended the invitation to the reservation through Naomi, who promised to spread the word among her people as the sun began its slow descent. Toward the horizon, the first wagon rattled up the drive. Pastor Roberts and his wife stepped down, carrying a basket of biscuits. The pastor's presence felt like a blessing, a sign that perhaps others would follow. "Bold move, Brother Boone," Pastor Roberts said, clasping Mateo's hand. "But the right one, I believe." More townspeople trickled in, the Cooper family, the widow Jensen, even old Doc Miller. They clustered together, speaking in low voices, casting uncertain glances toward the eastern path where the reservation lay. Then came the sound of horses' hooves. Not in wagons, but moving with the quiet grace of practiced riders. Naomi appeared. First, followed by several Ute families. Children peeked out from behind their parents' legs. Jonah walked beside his grandmother, carrying a small drum. The two groups stood apart at first, like water and oil refusing to mix. Mateo's throat tightened. Had he made a terrible mistake? But Christy, bless her heart, seemed to know exactly what to do. She grabbed her plate of cornbread and moved between the groups, offering pieces to everyone with the same bright smile. "Please try some," she said. "It's still warm." Slowly, cautiously, people began to accept. The simple act of taking food, of murmuring thanks, broke the first layer of ice. As twilight deepened, Mateo lit the lanterns. Their warm glow cast friendly shadows across faces, both pale and brown. The fire crackled to life, drawing folks closer. As the evening air cooled, Pastor Roberts started a familiar hymn, "Amazing Grace." The melody rose sweet and clear into the darkening sky. When it ended, Naomi nodded to Jonah. The boy lifted his drum and began a gentle rhythm, steady as a heartbeat. Another Ute elder joined in with a song in their own language. The words strange to some ears, but the feeling universal gratitude. Hope, connection to the land they all shared. The music wove together, hymns and tribal songs taking turns. Then, sometimes blending, children, less bound by adult prejudices, began to play together at the edge of the firelight. Their laughter rang out like silver bells. Mateo rose then, clearing his throat. All eyes turned to him, and he felt the weight of the moment press upon his shoulders. "Folks," he began, his voice quiet but carrying, "I thank you all for coming. Tonight, some might wonder why we're here, mixing together like this when custom says we shouldn't." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But I've been reading my Bible lately, thinking hard about how Jesus lived. He ate with outcasts. He welcomed strangers. He taught us that love of neighbor isn't just for those who look and think like us." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but no one interrupted. The fire popped and sparked, sending embers dancing upward like fireflies. "We all work this same land," Mateo continued. "We all pray to a Creator who made us all. Maybe it's time we stopped seeing differences and started seeing people." Thunderrunner chose that moment to whinny from his corral, as if adding his own agreement. Heads turned toward the sound, and Jonah stood slowly. His eyes met Mateo's, asking silent permission. Mateo nodded, and the boy walked to the corral. The crowd held its breath, remembering the wild stallion from the auction. But this was a different horse now. Thunderrunner stepped forward. Lowering his proud head to Jonah's level, the boy reached up, stroked the horse's nose, and then for the first time since his father's death, Jonah smiled. It was a small thing, that smile, but it transformed his whole face. The horse nickered softly, nuzzling the boy's shoulder. Something holy settled over the gathering. People bowed their heads as if witnessing a sermon more powerful than any words could deliver. The fire crackled. Jonah whispered to the horse in his native tongue, and suspicions seemed to melt away like morning frost in sunshine. CRI's appeared at Mateo's side, slipping her small hand into his. "Look, Papa," she whispered. Everyone's smiling now. She was right. Faces around the fire had softened. Mrs. Cooper was sharing her apple pie with one of the Ute women. Doc Miller sat listening intently as a tribal elder described traditional healing plants. Children played together, oblivious to the barriers their parents were just beginning to lower. The fire burned lower, sending up lazy sparks into the star-filled sky. One by one, folks began to gather their things, heading home. But they moved differently now, stopping to shake hands, to exchange words of thanks, to promise future meetings. "Good evening, Brother Boone," Pastor Robert said as he left. The Lord's work was done here tonight. Mateo watched the wagons and horses disappear into the darkness, each carrying away a small seed of hope. Mateo's chest felt full, like his heart might burst with relief. He hadn't known for sure if peace was possible, but now he had seen it with his own eyes. The last lantern burned low as Mateo, Christy, Naomi, and Jonah cleaned up together. Thunder Runner's soft nickering provided gentle background music to their work. Grandmother Jonah said quietly in the lantern light, "I think Father would be pleased." Naomi touched his shoulder, her eyes glistening. "Yes, grandson." Very pleased. Indeed, the peaceful evening's warmth lingered in Mateo's heart as he prepared for bed. Stars twinkled through his window, and a gentle breeze carried the last traces of wood smoke from the gathering. He knelt beside his bed, thanking the Lord for the miracle of changed hearts. Somewhere in that quiet darkness, hooves thundered against earth. Mateo's eyes snapped open. Angry voices shattered the night's peace, followed by the crash of breaking wood. His heart jumped as he recognized the sound of drunken whooping. "Raiders! Get out here, Boone!" a slurred voice bellowed. "Think you can shame us for them Injuns?" Mateo grabbed his coat, hands steady despite fear tightening his chest. As he rushed down the stairs, Christy appeared in her nightgown, eyes wide with fright. "Papa, what's happening?" "Stay inside, sweetheart," he ordered. But she was already following him to the door. Outside, moonlight revealed 5 mounted figures, their faces hidden by bandanas. The smell of whiskey carried on the wind. One rider held a burning lantern, swaying dangerously in his saddle. "Leave my property," Mateo commanded, stepping onto the porch. His voice rang with authority, despite his racing pulse. "You're drunk and causing trouble." "Trouble?" The leader laughed bitterly. "You brought trouble when you sided with them savages. Made us look weak." The rider with the lantern spurred his horse forward. "Let's show him what happens to Injun lovers." Before Mateo could move, the man hurled the lantern. It arced through the darkness, spraying burning oil as it shattered against the barn wall. Flames licked up the dry wood with frightening speed. "No!" Christy screamed, darting past Mateo toward the barn where Thunder Runner was stabled. "Christy, stop!" Mateo lunged for her, but she was too quick. The raiders' horses reared and plunged, excited by the fire. One crashed into a stack of lumber near the barn. Boards cascaded down with a thunderous crash, and Christy disappeared beneath them. Her cry of pain pierced Mateo's heart like a knife. He ran to the fallen lumber, throwing boards aside with desperate strength. Christy lay curled on her side, blood trickling from a gash on her forehead. Thunder Runner's terrified neighing split the air. The stallion crashed against his corral fence again and again until the rails splintered. With one mighty leap, he cleared the broken fence and vanished into the darkness, his hoofbeats fading like distant thunder. "What have you done?" The anguish in Mateo's voice carried across the yard. But the raiders were already wheeling there, horses around, fleeing into the night. Lantern light bobbed across the pasture as neighbors, awakened by the commotion, hurried toward the ranch. Too late to catch the raiders. Too late to stop any of it. Mateo gathered Christy in his arms, her small body limp against his chest. "Stay with me, sweetheart," he whispered, carrying her inside. Her skin felt clammy, and her breathing came in. Shallow gasps as he laid her on her bed. Quiet footsteps entered the house. Naomi appeared in the doorway, Jonah closed behind her. They had come to deliver food after the gathering, only to find chaos instead of continued peace. "Let me see her," Naomi said, moving to Christy's bedside with the authority of long experience. Her weathered hands gently examined the wound while Jonah held a lamp steady. Christ moaned, trying to turn away from the touch. "It hurts, Papa. I know, little one. Be still now." Mateo's hands trembled as he smoothed her hair back from the injury. Naomi spoke quietly to Jonah in their native tongue, and the boy rushed out. She pulled herbs from a leather pouch at her waist, crushing them between her fingers. The sharp, clean scent filled the room. "Hold this against the wound," she instructed Mateo, pressing the herbs into a cloth. "It will help stop bleeding, ease pain." Outside, neighbors were working to control the barn fire. The sound of shouted orders and splashing water drifted through the window, but Mateo barely heard them. His world had narrowed to his daughter's pale face and shallow breathing. Jonah returned with water and more of Naomi's supplies. The boy's eyes were wide with worry as he watched his grandmother work. He kept glancing toward the window, toward the direction Thunder Runner had fled. "The horse," he started to say, but Naomi silenced him with a look. Mateo's shoulders slumped. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd hoped to build, seemed to be crumbling. The peace of the gathering felt like a dream now, shattered by hatred and violence. His daughter lay injured, the horse was gone, and the fragile bridge between. Communities lay in splinters like the broken corral fence. Naomi's quiet voice cut through his despair. "She is strong, like her father. She will heal." She pressed a cup of herbal tea to Christy's lips. "Small sips, child." Christy managed a few swallows before sinking back against the pillows. Her eyes fluttered closed, but her breathing had steadied. "The raiders," Mateo said, his voice rough with emotion. "Did anyone recognize them?" "A sheriff's been told." A neighbor called from the doorway. "Fire's under control, Mateo. Barn scorched, but standing. We'll help repair it tomorrow." Mateo nodded. His thanks, but the kindness only emphasized what had been lost. How could he face the community now? How could he rebuild trust after this? Jonah stood quietly by the window, his young face troubled in the lamplight. "Thunder Runner will return," he said softly. "He knows his true home," but Mateo wasn't sure of anything anymore. He sank into the chair beside Christy's bed, watching her sleep. The night stretched long before him, filled with the weight of broken dreams and the bitter taste of failure. Naomi moved about the room with quiet efficiency, preparing more medicines, whispering prayers in her native tongue. Her presence was steady, anchoring even as everything else seemed to drift away into darkness. Outside, the last flames sputtered and died. Neighbors dispersed with promises to return at dawn. The night grew quiet again, but it was no longer the peaceful silence of earlier. Now, it felt heavy with loss and the knowledge that hatred could destroy in moments what love had taken weeks to build. Mateo reached for Christy's small hand, holding it gently. Her fingers were warm, a small mercy in a night of terrors. But the sight of the bruises darkening on her pale skin made his heart ache anew. Thunder Runner's distant whinny echoed across the valley, faint as a ghost. Then silence fell again, broken only by Christy's soft breathing and the whisper of Naomi's prayers. Dawn crept across the valley, painting the sky in shades of steel gray. Inside the Boone Ranch house, the air hung thick with worry. Christy tossed restlessly in her bed, her nightgown damp with fever sweat. The cut on her forehead had swollen an angry red line against her pale skin. Mateo hadn't left her side all night. His shoulders ached from sitting in the wooden chair, but exhaustion couldn't overcome his guilt. Every time Christy whimpered in her sleep, the sound pierced his heart like a blade. Here, Naomi pressed a cool cloth into his hands. "Wipe her brow again." He dabbed gently at Christie's forehead, careful to avoid the wound. Her skin burned beneath. His touch. Outside, wagon wheels creaked as neighbors passed by on the road, but no one stopped to check on them. The same folk who had gathered around his fire just days ago now hurried past, eyes averted. Jonah worked quietly in the corner, grinding herbs with a stone mortar. The steady rhythm of his work filled the silence. The boy had refused to leave, even when Naomi suggested he rest. The poultice needs changing, Naomi said, her weathered hands already preparing fresh herbs. She mixed them with careful precision, adding just enough water to form a paste. The sharp, medicinal scent cut through the sickroom air. Mateo couldn't bear it any longer. He pushed himself up from the chair, his joints protesting. "I need some air," he mumbled, though no one had asked. The morning air felt cool on his face as he crossed the yard. His boots left tracks in the dew-dampened earth. The barn's scorched walls stood as a stark reminder of last night's violence. The broken corral fence gaped like an open wound. Inside the barn, morning light filtered through gaps in the walls, catching dust motes in golden beams. The empty stall where Thunder Runner had stood seemed to mock him. Mateo's knees gave way, and he sank onto a hay bale. "Lord," he whispered, his voice rough with unshed tears. "I thought I was doing your will, showing mercy, building bridges." He buried his face in his hands. "But my pride, my stubborn pride, brought this on us. Christie's hurt because of me. The horse is gone. Everything's broken." The confession opened something in him, and tears began to fall. He wept for his daughter's pain, for the shattered peace, for his own failures. The sound of his grief echoed in the empty barn. Soft footsteps in hay announced Jonah's presence. The boy stood quietly in the doorway, watching with eyes that held wisdom beyond his years. "Thunder Runner waits," Jonah said simply. His voice carried certainty, like a rope thrown to a drowning man. Mateo wiped his eyes with his sleeve. "How can you know? He is my father's horse. I know his heart." Jonah stepped closer, standing straight and tall. "But you must trust me as brother, not boy. The mountain paths are treacherous. Only together can we bring him home." The words struck Mateo like a physical blow. Here was this child, offering not just help but brotherhood when grown men had turned away. Mateo saw then what his own prejudices had blinded him to: the dignity and strength in Jonah's bearing, the legacy of warriors in his blood. "You're right," Mateo said, his voice steadying. "What do we need?" Together they gathered supplies, dried beef jerky from the kitchen, wool blankets rolled tight, matches wrapped in oilcloth, and a full flask of lantern oil. Jonah added a small medicine pouch Naomi had prepared, fragrant with healing herbs. Back in the house, Christie stirred as Mateo approached her bedside. Her eyes fluttered open, glazed with fever, but still alert enough to recognize him. "I have to go for a little while, sweetheart," he said softly, taking her small hand in his. "Naomi will care for you until I return." Christie's fingers tightened weakly around his. "Bring him back, Papa," she whispered. "Bring hope with him." The simple faith in her voice nearly undid him. He kissed her forehead gently, mindful of the wound. "I promise." Naomi stood by the bed, her face grave but composed. "The fever will break by sunset," she said. "I will not leave her side." In the yard, Mateo's old gelding stamped impatiently, already saddled. Jonah sat astride his own pony, a sturdy mountain breed well suited to rough terrain. The boy had changed into buckskins, a quiver of arrows strapped across his back. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, promising storms. The spring air carried the sharp scent of coming rain. As Mateo swung into the saddle, his joints protested the sleepless night. But determination pushed aside discomfort. "Which way?" he asked, deliberately yielding leadership to Jonei. The boy pointed toward the mountains, rising purple against the threatening sky. He will seek high ground, away from men. There is a valley my father showed me, where wild horses gather near. A spring. Matteo nodded, settling his hat firmly against the rising wind. Without another word, they rode out, leaving the ranch behind. The gelding's hooves beat a steady rhythm on the hard-packed earth. Beside him, Jonei rode with the easy grace of one born to the saddle. They passed the last fence line marking Boone property, then turned toward the rising slopes. The familiar landscape of the valley fell away behind them as they climbed. Ahead, the mountains waited, their peaks lost in gathering storm clouds. Thunder rumbled in the distance, like drums calling them onward. Matteo felt the weight of the moment, a white rancher following a native boy's lead, their shared purpose burning away the boundaries of race and age. Perhaps this, he thought, was what real brotherhood looked like. Trust given freely. Wisdom recognized wherever it dwelled. The trail steepened. And the first drops of rain began to fall. The first snowflakes drifted down like feathers, catching the weak afternoon light. Matteo pulled his coat tighter, watching as white began to dust the canyon walls rising around them. The spring storm had followed them into the heights, turning from rain to snow as they climbed. Trails getting harder to read, he called to Jonei, who rode slightly ahead. The boy nodded, his buckskin jacket already speckled with snow. Their horses picked their way carefully over the rocky ground, hooves clattering on loose stones. The canyon narrowed, its walls streaked with red and ochre beneath the gathering white. Wind whistled through the stone corridors, carrying the bite of winter's last gasp. What had been clear paths hours ago now disappeared under deepening drifts. Jonei reined his pony to a stop, studying the ground. "Thunder Runner passed here," he said, pointing to a half-buried hoofprint. But the snow covers his sign too quickly. Matteo's old gelding snorted, steam rising from its nostrils. The afternoon was waning, and the temperature dropped with each passing hour. They needed shelter before full dark. There, Jonei gestured toward a massive pine that grew against the canyon wall, its branches creating a natural windbreak. "Can make camp beneath it." Relief flooded through Matteo's tired muscles. They'd been riding since dawn, and the cold had settled deep in his bones. They dismounted, leading their horses into the relative shelter of the pine. Working together, they cleared snow from beneath the lowest branches. Jonei gathered dry pine needles for bedding, while Matteo unpacked his battered kettle. Soon, a small fire crackled, carefully placed to reflect heat off the canyon wall. "Not much for supper," Matteo apologized, adding dried beef and a handful of beans to the water. "But it'll be hot at least." Jonei didn't complain. He sat cross-legged near the fire, his face thoughtful in the dancing light. The boy had shown remarkable endurance throughout the day, never once suggesting they turn back despite the worsening weather. The thin stew slowly began to bubble. Matteo stirred it with a wooden spoon, watching snowflakes hiss and vanish in the flames. The horses stood close together under the pine's outer branches, their backs to the wind. They ate in comfortable silence, passing the kettle back and forth. The hot food, simple as it was, brought some warmth back to their bodies. Matteo found himself studying Jonei's profile, seeing echoes of the warrior father he must have lost. "Thank you," Matteo said quietly, "for knowing these mountains, for helping me find him." Jonei nodded, his eyes on the fire. Thunder Runner, his family. Like my father was family. He spoke the words simply, but they carried weight. As the fire burned low, they wrapped themselves in blankets. The snow continued falling, but the pine's thick branches kept the worst of it off. Matteo dozed fitfully, his dreams full of Christie's fever-bright face. Some hours later, he woke to soft murmuring. Opening his eyes, he saw Jonei kneeling in the dim light of the banked fire. The boy's hands were raised, palms up. As he prayed in the liquid syllables of his native tongue, Matteo lay still, not wanting to interrupt. Though he couldn't understand the words, the reverence in Jonet's voice was familiar. It echoed his own prayers, his own reaching toward heaven for guidance and strength. The boy finished his prayer with a gentle amen that brought an unexpected ache to Matteo's chest. Faith, he realized, spoke in many tongues but rose from the same deep well of hope. Dawn broke steel-gray and bitter. They ate the last of their jerky, stamping feet against the cold. The snow had stopped, leaving the canyon transformed into a world of white and shadow. "Look here," Jonet called, examining the ground near their sheltered camp. Thunder Runner passed in the night. His tracks are fresh. Matteo's heart leaped. The stallion's massive hoofprints cut clear through the new snow, heading toward higher ground. They quickly saddled their mounts and set out, following the erratic trail. "He's running scared," Jonet said, frowning at the pattern of tracks. "See how he switches direction? Like he's looking for something, but can't find it." The trail led them up steeper slopes where pine gave way to bare rock. Ice made the footing treacherous. Their horses moved with agonizing slowness, testing each step. Near midday, they reached a stream crossing. The water ran black between snow-covered banks, partially frozen at the edges. Fresh tracks showed where Thunder Runner had passed through, sending up sprays of icy water. Matteo dismounted to lead his gelding across. His boots slipped on a frozen stone, and he felt himself falling. Before he could hit the water, Joan's strong grip caught his arm. "Careful, brother," the boy said, steadying him. "The crossing is dangerous." Their eyes met, and suddenly they were both laughing, the sound echoing off canyon walls. It was a release of tension, a moment of shared relief that broke through the morning's grim focus. But the lighter mood couldn't last. As afternoon faded toward evening, the storm returned with savage force. Wind howled down the canyon, driving snow and ice before it. Visibility dropped to mere feet. "We have to stop," Matteo shouted over the wind. "We'll lose the trail in this." They found minimal shelter behind a stone outcrop, but the cold was brutal. Without discussion, they huddled together under their shared blankets, using body heat to stay warm. Their horses pressed close, offering what protection they could against the wind in the storm's fury. Matteo felt small against the mountain's power. Yet gratitude filled his heart. Gratitude for the boy's wilderness wisdom, for his unfailing courage. Without Jonet, he would have been lost hours ago, perhaps frozen in some nameless canyon. "Lord," he prayed silently as darkness fell, "thank you for sending me a brother when I thought I rode alone." The storm raged on, but under their shared blanket, two souls from different worlds had found common ground in trust and respect. Tomorrow, they would resume their search for Thunder Runner. But tonight, they were simply two travelers helping each other survive the mountain's test. The storm showed no signs of mercy as morning stretched into midday. Wind howled through the canyon, driving sheets of snow that stung like needles against any exposed skin. Matteo and Jonet pressed forward, their horses struggling against the gusts that threatened to push them off the narrow trail. "We have to find shelter soon," Matteo shouted over the wind's roar. His words were nearly lost in the storm's fury. The cold had worked its way deep into his bones, making every movement an effort. Jonet pointed ahead, his arms shaking from the cold. "Look there." Through the swirling white, a dark shape moved against the canyon wall. Thunder Runner stood precariously on a narrow ledge, his black coat stark against the snow-covered rock. The stallion's powerful body trembled, his hooves scrambling for purchase on the icy stone. Matteo's heart leaped into his throat. The ledge couldn't have been more than 3 feet wide, with a sheer drop of at least 50 feet below. One wrong move would send the horse plummeting to the canyon floor. His hands moved instinctively to his coiled rope. "We need to get a line on him before he falls." "No." Jonei's voice cut through the wind with surprising force. The boy's eyes were intense, fixed on the frightened horse. "The rope will only make him fight. He must choose trust." Matteo hesitated, the rope heavy in his hands. Every instinct from years of ranching told him to take control, to force the issue before tragedy struck. But something in Jonei's steady gaze made him pause. "What do you suggest?" he asked, having to lean close to make himself heard. "Together," Jonei said, slow and gentle. "Let him remember who we are." They dismounted, securing their horses to a stunted pine. The wind buffeted them as they approached the ledge, their boots crunching in the fresh snow. Thunder Runner's eyes rolled wildly, showing white around the edges. His nostrils flared, steam rising in the frigid air. Matteo pulled off his gloves, tucking them into his belt. His fingers immediately began to ache with cold. But he knew Jonei was right. The horse needed to feel a human touch. Not leather and rope. The ledge seemed even narrower up close. Matteo's stomach churned as he glanced down at the dizzying drop, then forced his eyes back to the horse. He took a careful step onto the ledge, pressing his back against the canyon wall. Almost without thinking, he began to hum. The melody of an old psalm rose above the wind's moan, steady and familiar. It was the same tune he often sang while doing evening chores. The same one that had soothed Christy through childhood fears. Beside him, Jonei started speaking in his native tongue. The Ute words flowed like water, gentle and continuous. "Oh boy." Extended his hand, palm up, in a gesture of peace. Thunder Runner's ears swiveled toward their voices. His trembling eased slightly, though his hooves still shifted nervously on the narrow shelf of rock. "That's it," Matteo whispered, continuing to hum between words. "Easy now, brother. We're here to help." They moved forward with agonizing slowness, giving the horse time to accept each tiny advance. Snow gathered on their shoulders and hair, but neither man nor boy dared brush it away. Any sudden movement might spook the stallion into disaster. Inch by inch, Matteo drew closer. His fingers had gone numb with cold, but he kept them extended, offering contact. Thunder Runner's breath came in great gusts, his sides heaving with fear and exhaustion. "Almost there," Jonei murmured, his quiet Ute words never ceasing. "He remembers us now." See how his eyes change? It was true. The wild panic was fading from the horse's gaze, replaced by something closer to recognition. His head lowered slightly, nostrils flaring as he caught their scent. Finally, Matteo's hand made contact with the stallion's neck. The horse flinched but didn't pull away. Matteo ran his fingers through the coarse mane, working slowly up to the broad forehead. "Good boy," he breathed. "Such a good, brave boy." Thunder Runner leaned into his touch, seemingly desperate for comfort. Jonei moved closer, adding his own hands to the gentle stroking. Together, they worked to calm the great horse, their touch promising safety and protection. "Now we walk him out," Jonei said softly, "but we must let him choose each step." They positioned themselves on either side of Thunder Runner's head, not holding or pulling, but simply offering guidance. The stallion stood frozen for several long moments, trembling. "Your choice," Matteo told him, continuing to stroke his neck. "We'll wait as long as you need." As if understanding, Thunder Runner lifted one hoof and placed it carefully behind him. Then another step and another. Moving with excruciating slowness, they began to retrace their path along the ledge. The wind caught at them, threatening their balance. Snow made the footing treacherous, but step by step, foot by foot, they worked their way back to safer ground. When they finally reached the wider trail, Thunder Runner's legs were shaking with strain. He stopped, sides heaving, and dropped his proud head between Matteo and Jonay as if in gratitude. The tension drained from Matteo's body so suddenly that his knees gave way. He sank into the snow, not caring about the cold. Beside him, Jonay did the same, and suddenly they were both laughing, great whooping laughs of pure relief that echoed off the canyon walls. Thunder Runner looked down at them, his expression almost puzzled. Then, to their amazement, he carefully lowered himself to lie in the snow between them, offering warmth and shelter from the wind. "Look at that," Matteo gasped between laughs. "He's protecting us now." Jonay's face shone with joy and triumph. Knows we are his family, all of us, together. They sat in the snow, leaning against the horse's broad sides, letting their laughter fade into comfortable silence. The storm still raged, but in that moment, they had created a pocket of peace in its midst. Matteo reached across Thunder Runner's back to grasp Jonay's hand. "Thank you," he said simply, "for teaching me to trust." The boy squeezed his hand in return. "And thank you for listening. Not many men would." Thunder Runner nickered softly, as if adding his own thoughts to the conversation. Despite their exhaustion, despite the cold and danger, they found themselves laughing again. Man, boy, and horse, united by something stronger than fear or prejudice in that moment. High in the storm-racked mountains, Matteo understood that they had done more than save a horse. They had proven that trust could bridge any divide, that faith could move not just mountains, but hearts. The mountain path wound down through patches of melting snow. 2 days had passed since the rescue, and the storm's fury had finally eased into gentle flurries. Matteo and Jonay walked beside Thunder Runner, their boots leaving deep prints in the softening earth. That evening, they made camp in a sheltered grove. The fire crackled, casting warm light on their tired faces. Jonay stared into the flames, his voice growing quiet as he spoke of his father. "He was the bravest man I knew," Jonay said. "He taught me that courage isn't just for fighting, it's for making peace too." His eyes glistened as he lifted them skyward. "I pray that one day our peoples will live side by side, sharing this land as neighbors should." Matteo watched the boy, feeling his own heart soften at the wisdom in those young words. They reached Boone Ranch as dusk painted the sky purple. Christy lay propped up in bed, her face pale but alive. Naomi sat nearby, grinding herbs for another healing tea. When Thunder Runner's whinny echoed through the yard, Christy's eyes brightened. "Papa kept his promise," she whispered, a weak smile touching her lips. Matteo dropped to his knees beside her bed, tears flowing freely as he gave thanks to God. Word spread quickly through town. As night fell, neighbors began gathering at the fence line, their faces curious and expectant, waiting to see what Matteo would do with the returned stallion. Morning sunlight bathed the town square as Matteo guided Thunder Runner down the muddy street. The stallion's hooves clicked steadily against scattered stones, his coat gleaming like polished coal. Behind them, the wagon wheels creaked as Jonay held the reins. With Christy wrapped in quilts beside him, her face still pale but determined. Townsfolk emerged from shops and homes, drawn by the unusual sight. They gathered near the white-painted church, their whispers rising like wind through prairie grass. Some men gripped rifle stocks, others crossed arms and scowled. The Indian agent stood apart, his jaw tight with barely contained anger. Matteo halted Thunder Runner in the center of the crowd. His voice carried clear and strong across the morning air. "This horse belongs not to me, nor to any man who would use him for pride. He belongs with the boy whose people gave him life." With steady hands, he led Thunder Runner to where Jonay stood. The boy's eyes widened as Matteo placed the worn leather reins in his grasp. For a heartbeat, no one moved or spoke. Then, one by one, the ranchers removed their hats. The pastor bowed his gray head in silent blessing. Even those who had opposed. Mateo couldn't deny the rightness of this moment. The Indian agent's face darkened, but he remained still, powerless against this simple act of justice. From the wagon, Christy beamed at her father, her eyes bright with joyful tears. Her prayers had been answered not just for Thunder Runner's return, but for her father's courage to choose what was right. Weeks later, spring warmth draped Boone Ranch in golden light. Near the barn, Christy sat on a hay bale, her strength returning day by day. She cradled a newborn lamb while Naomi demonstrated how to check its breathing. The elderly woman's weathered. Hands moved with gentle precision, her wisdom flowing as naturally as creek water in the distance. Dust rose as Mateo and Jonah guided cattle towards summer grazing lands. They rode easily together, their shadows stretching long across sun-baked. Earth Thunder Runner grazed in a nearby meadow, lifting his proud head occasionally to watch them. He remained close by choice now, no ropes needed. As evening approached, lamplight spilled from the Boone kitchen windows. Inside, the long table groaned under bowls of steaming stew. Townspeople and youths sat shoulder to shoulder, passing cornbread and trading stories. Laughter rang out where suspicion once festered. The pastor's deep voice carried through the room as he read from the Psalms. And even the most stubborn ranchers nodded in solemn agreement. Mateo stepped onto the porch as dusk painted the mountains pink. Christy joined him, her small hand warm. On his arm, "Papa," she whispered, "we're not alone anymore." He smiled softly. What men call untamable, God calls redeemable. Together they watched Thunder Runner silhouetted against the sunset, his presence a living bridge between two peoples. Peace settled over the valley like a blessing, proof that faith, mercy, and courage could heal even the deepest divides. Thanks for taking a moment to feel with me. If this story reminded you of what matters, hit subscribe. I'll be here tomorrow, continuing our story.